Hello and welcome to the Ego Podcast. My name is Dina Jackson and I am your host. Today we are live from Eggplant Picture and Sound Studios in downtown Toronto, and I have a wonderful guest with me. She is an author, she is a speaker, she is an advocate for homeless youth, and she's been featured on, I'm just looking at all your credits here, CTV, City TV, Global News, The Marilyn Dennis Show, and her book, Missing, A True Story of a Childhood Lost, is available online and in stores for purchase. Please welcome Marnie Grundman, everyone.
Thank you for having me, Dina.
Thank you so much for coming. I really, really appreciate it. I have so many questions for you. I don't even know where to start. For everyone listening, Marnie delivered an amazing speech last week at a TEDx conference. It was TEDx Trinity Bellwoods, which was held downtown Toronto, and she gave a speech depicting a lot of things that you have covered in your book, and from your own life story that was very captivating. You had the whole room, and I don't think that's the first time or the last time that that'll happen. And so I was very, very moved. And so I'm very grateful that you're here today to discuss some of your work, give some insight to listeners into the advocacy work that you do, and just some information about your story, but also runaways and working with homeless youth and being an advocate. So thank you, Marnie. I would like to, can I launch into my first question for you?
Please do, yeah.
Okay, cool. So I'd love to hear anything that you'd like to share on your process in terms of what brought you to working in the area of advocacy and also healing, specifically with homeless youth. You don't have to go into your whole speech now, but whatever you'd like to share.
Well, in a nutshell, I had sat down and started writing a book about, I started writing 3.5 years ago. And I was a homeless youth. At 13 years old, I found myself living on park benches in abandoned buildings, apartment complex saunas, everything that went along with being a kid on the streets. And as I began to write the book, my intention was to connect to other people who had been through similar situations, because for me, that was something I was always looking for, was that connection to someone who had gone through what I did by way of running away from home and running away from abuse, which is the majority of the reason that children who run end up on the streets. People would ask me what I was writing about, and I would say a runaway. And immediately you'd see their body language change, like they kind of lean back a little bit. There was a judgment right away. Very few people didn't behave that way, or react that way, I should say. And so I started to experiment. I thought, okay, well, this isn't going to be the way to go in the way that I tell my story then. So when somebody would ask me, I started playing with words. And I just said, well, it's about a missing child. Immediately they leaned in. Oh. Well, what happened? And then the word runaway lost all its power, all of its stigma, because there was a story that went along with it that softened people's reaction. People hear a child runs away, they think it's, a kid who's just misbehaving or got a bad grade, or, as if a child would prefer a park bench to live on because they got a bad grade. But that's how the journey started, and it's what made me realize that even though I thought we were in a place in society now with our knowledge of psychology and cause and effect and things like that, I thought we were much further ahead, and there wasn't a need for that. And it turns out I was really wrong. So that's a big reason for what I do and why I do it and how I ended up in it, I suppose. Yeah.
Wow. I remember in your talk you mentioned that about what it would take for someone to not want to sleep in their own bed at night. Yeah. And I found that very impactful, because it's like, there is so much stigma around there. So you are working on every day breaking down stigma with what you're doing. But I think putting an image to that the way that you have, it asks people to go inside their own experience. And I think, I don't know anyone who
would willingly do that.
Right. Oh,
exactly.
You got a bad grade and you're rebelling, so you're going to not sleep in your bed and be on a park bench, especially at the age of 12 or at whatever age. Nobody makes that choice.
Age of now, like 30 or 40 or 50, or, something has to happen, because of course we see that there's adults who end up homeless. And typically that happens because of a tragic event, or it might be happening because of domestic violence, or it could obviously be happening because of living paycheck to paycheck. But the norm of what we see out there, it's a tragic event that's thrown them out there somehow, something traumatic.
I remember another thing that you mentioned was that that this situation, or like the homelessness situation or trauma specifically, as to what someone might have been experiencing at home that caused them to have to leave, that trauma sees no class,
Yeah.
right? And so one thing you mentioned was that the very vast percentage of people who leave home lived in middle class or upper middle class homes, and I didn't know that. Watching that, I was like, I didn't.
It's associated with poverty,
Right.
because everything bad happens with poverty.
Right.
And the problem with that is, if a child from an impoverished background comes forward with abuse, we're likely to believe them, because it's kind of like, the good and the evil. It's the knight in shining armor is always dressed in white and like has everything like down pat, and the bad guys dressed in black and falling apart. And so we're conditioned through movies and media, everything that we see, that a bad home has a certain packaging and a good home has a certain packaging. So when a child is running away from home and it's a really nice place, nothing bad happens behind pretty doors, as I always say, they're less likely to be looked upon as being in a troubled environment. Rather, they're the trouble. And until we really get a grip of that, people aren't going to help the way that they can, because they don't have the awareness to do so. They just think it's a spoiled kid.
It's just so crazy thinking about that stigma, but you're right. I mean, and I love what you're doing for many reasons.
Yeah.
One of them being that you're addressing an issue that many people either choose to not pay attention to, or they're just unaware. So as a result, they become complacent, and what I'm referencing is everyone walks down the street. Everyone does that. If you live in a city, in an urban center, there's going to be someone on not every street corner, but in Toronto, there's
much.
a fair amount,
Yeah.
right? And so a lot of people, and I know that I've been in this position, you don't necessarily know what to do. Right away, your mind goes to stigma. Right away, your mind thinks, oh, well, maybe this person is going to spend it on drugs. I don't want to give them money to, and so somehow that becomes an easy solution.
Sure.
In I would say in my mind as the one walking, oh, okay, I'm going to make that decision. And where does that thought even come from? That comes from stigma, like you were talking
Right.
about. It blows my mind what you were saying about the body language that people had towards you when you had said, oh, I was a runaway, versus not using that word, and how different their reaction was. Just leaning in and being more engaged when you speak about a missing child. Somehow that seems to resonate with people in a very different way.
Because they recognize a missing child as being a victim, and they don't recognize a runaway as being a victim.
Right.
Because running away sounds like it was a well thought out event, when it's a knee-jerk reaction to trauma. It's rare that a child who runs away has like a major plan and a backpack and a bunch of money on them. It's just, there may be kids out there that do that, but it's certainly not the norm, because you can't predict when the trauma is going to happen. And as far as walking by the homeless, there's a lot of times I don't have any money on me. I might have already given it away.
Right.
Or
I feel like you've already given, if it's you've already given it away.
Usually by that point, or it might be, I prefer to duck in somewhere and get them something to eat, or get them a gift card, because it also gives them access to a bathroom. And obviously I'm a little bit aware of that.
Right.
But at least to acknowledge and say, look, I'm sorry, I don't have any change. And, just acknowledge that person is living and breathing, instead of walking past them like they're invisible, because you don't know. There might have been 3 days that went by and nobody even glanced in their direction. And that's, it's demoralizing even further than their situation. It's isolating where they are. And it costs nothing to just give a moment of acknowledgement, even if it's not the answer you feel they want to hear. It's something. Something's always better than nothing, right? So
yeah, of course. I mean, even just making that effort to smile at someone.
Something so simple.
because no, it's literally the worst thing that anyone can feel or do to another person is to just completely ignore them, or to feel completely ignored,
Yeah.
because that just isolates you for sure. So just talking specifically about trauma, because this seems to be a reoccurring topic on the podcast as of recently. I've been learning a lot about it in the process of it, and I'm very grateful for that. So anyone listening is gaining that. And our last guest, Dr. Teresa Marsh, she does a lot of work on, she calls it renegotiating trauma. And so she's working in indigenous communities with people who have suffered from traumatic experiences and now suffer from addiction as a result.
Mm-hmm.
And so she does a lot of work in those two things being intertwined and recognizing that. And so one thing that she mentioned, and I wanted to hear your take on this, is that trauma, she believes trauma lives in the body. And myself, I teach yoga and meditation, and it's something that I do see a lot in classes, where there's certain poses that you can do where you can release a lot of trauma or emotions, feelings, particularly hip openers, things like that. And so I'm wondering if you agree with this idea that trauma can live in
100%.
Yeah.
I think your body remembers it, and it's really interesting because there's times where I've had traumatic events, obviously, that have happened in my life.
Mm-hmm.
The death of my first stepfather, for example, it's been over 30 years, and I may not even be aware of it, but all of a sudden I'll start feeling sad or melancholy or anxious or whatever it is, and I look at the calendar and it's always within that week of when he died. Like, before I even realize, oh my God, this is coming up, my body remembers that it went through such a horrific loss, that it just lives in you.
Mm-hmm.
And when you become aware of that and you're able to identify it, then you're able to move through it much easier. Self-care, and also not feel bad about it. It's just we all have things in our life that have impacted us, and it's okay to feel sad on those occasions, and just let it be and let it rest and let it go. So yeah, I 1,000% agree with that.
Cool. It's good to know and recognize, because I think for a lot of people listening, they may feel it. We all feel things,
but they can't. They haven't tied it.
Right.
They haven't solved that piece of the puzzle of, oh, that's why
do I feel this way? Whereas if they, like the whole, like you were mentioning, cause and effect, like the entire chain of things that happen, you're feeling this way as an effect of many other things that brought you to that point, right? And so, like you were saying, yeah, your body remembers it even if your mind doesn't in that moment, and that's
it's
very
kind of crazy.
Yeah.
it really is. But it's the way. It's just your body is an amazing thing. Your brain is an amazing thing. We know how things work, but we really don't.
Right.
The depths.
Totally. And that, that study that says that we only use 10% of our brain, like that still boggles my mind all the time. I'm like, well, what else is going on? Yeah. Well, I'd like access.
Imagine if, right?
That would be nice, just to tap in for a little while.
It might be nice, or it might be really overwhelming. It might be our body's way of going, no, you don't really want to do that.
This is enough. We'll leave it at 10.
Yeah.
So this being the Ego Podcast, if you're wondering the name, it started off as, because I work in entertainment as a stand-up comedian, and I do speaking as well. And there's a lot of ego in that world. There's a lot of ego everywhere. But one of the cool things about this podcast was the more that I started to look at what some people might determine ego and tactics for managing the ego, I discovered other comedians, other people in my community there who practice meditation or other types of beneficial mental health practices. And so it's sort of morphed into a place where people share tactics they use for healing. And so you and I chatted a little bit before recording just about some of your own processes for that. And you had mentioned the sitting Shiva process in the Jewish faith.
Yes.
And that this was something that's been very helpful for you. And so I'm wondering if you could share that, because I have an interest in it. I mentioned my dad's family is Jewish, and I'm still investigating a lot of that side. So anyway, I'm just interested.
Well, so for people that don't know, sitting Shiva is something that happens when a relative dies. And if it's a close relative, the immediate family, we do what's called sitting Shiva, which is 7 days of basically being in these low chairs, focusing on our grief. People are coming by and giving their condolences and taking care of us. And we're in these little low chairs from early in the morning until, I guess, dusk or whatever it is. I'm not a very religious Jew or religious person. So this was actually the first time I sat Shiva in my adult life. And I was a little bit bitter about it at the time because I want to grieve the way I want to grieve.
Right.
And what I realized when I came out of Shiva, that it's actually the most beautiful way to grieve anything, because it forces you to do that. It forces you to make peace with those emotions and make peace with your loss. And when you leave that situation while you're still carrying sadness, you're obviously still mourning. It's different. It's lighter. And so when I started to write my book, there were points where it just knocked me flat emotionally, because it was basically like reliving all of my traumas, and reliving them in a really up close and personal way. And I always tell people that if you're looking to really heal from something, start writing about those things, because it will uncover memories that you're holding on in your body that you may not be aware of. And as this was going on, I had to step back, and I decided to give myself 4 days. Don't know why 4, but it just seemed like a reasonable number to me, to sit back and grieve and really sit Shiva. And I literally did nothing but cry and sleep and lock myself away, didn't look at a cell phone, nothing. And I just focused on the things that I lost. I lost my whole childhood. It doesn't mean it doesn't still make me sad, but there was something about really allowing myself the luxury of mourning that I let go of so much. Instead of being in a hurry of, I had said to you earlier, we're told don't live in the past, which has translated to don't think about the past. Well, if you don't live there long enough to actually deal with those pieces, you're always living in the past, because it's dragging on your coattails with every step you take. Whereas if you process it and you allow yourself that luxury of if you want to think it's feeling sorry for yourself, whatever it is, it doesn't matter. What matters is that you grieve, you work through it, and then you don't have anything so heavily hanging on you anymore. And when the pieces come up, you'll notice that they're a lot lighter, a lot more manageable. There may be new ones that come up because you've now made room for them, and you can process those, and it's all on a path to living a lighter life and feeling better. So
I really like that.
Yeah, that's what I learned. Didn't know that was going to happen, but I speak a lot on that as well, because of the fact that there's a stigma also attached to taking the time to grieve our losses. Like, people are afraid for us that we're going to be stuck in victim mode or whatever it is. But sometimes you need to be. And there's nothing wrong with that.
And accepting that time, so that way it doesn't stay with you, like you're saying. I find it so interesting that, like, you're right, there's so much stigma around it. And I find it fascinating that, if you were to break your arm physically, people would look at that and say, okay, you have to go.
You need a cast.
And it needs to heal. But if it's emotional, there isn't that same acceptance, because it's something that you can't physically see, and for whatever reason we just won't accept that. We're working towards it. There's a lot of things happening right now moving towards positive mental health practices, which is great, but I think it's almost a revolt to so much of the opposite for such a long time, right?
I think so too. And I think that it makes mental health issues that much more difficult, because they're not always just organic, they're also environmental. And if you're not dealing with those things that happened in your environment, it's taking a harder hold on somebody that has something that's organic as well. And I think it gives PTSD more power, because that comes from triggers that you haven't dealt with. So it's all, it's not in one little compartment. It's got to all come together.
Yeah. And recognizing every part of that. I think that what you were saying about the sitting Shiva practice, what's so interesting is just finding that stillness, and allowing all
And I
of
was
that.
terrified of that stillness, by the way.
Because you were saying, right? Because there's
Yeah.
tension. You were saying you didn't want to do it.
No, because I remember when I first started in my 20s, I went through a long period where I was dealing with flashbacks. Everything in my daily life was a trigger of some sort. And I was in heavy, deep counseling for about 2.5 years as a result. And it got to the point I was afraid to go to sleep and dream. I was afraid to stay awake and have something triggered. And I felt like I would if I started to really cry, I would never be able to stop. And the truth is, of course you're going to be able to stop, but it was very overwhelming, really frightening, and I think it's part of the reason that we put off dealing with it, because we think it's never going to go away and that it's going to take over our entire life, and is this ever going to stop, kind of thing. And the truth is, as soon as you rip that Band-Aid off, you've taken the power, and you've taken the power away from all of those triggers and feelings, because you've decided how you're going to deal with it instead of the other way around.
Oh, I love that. You're the master, not the pawn, or whatever. Yeah,
you're in control. And I mean, a lot of things that happen to us, those traumatic events, one of the worst parts about that it was the loss of control. So if you look at it as, no, this is not controlling me, I'm taking control of how I choose to deal with this,
right,
it's very empowering.
And it's not necessarily as bad as you may have anticipated. It's still going to be bad.
Was pretty bad.
Yeah.
but
maybe it didn't last as long.
Yeah, but it was good too.
Good to get it out, right?
Yeah, I don't want to trick anyone. Like, I don't want to mislead anyone. Listen, it sucked.
Yeah.
It was
totally.
It was sad, and it was devastating, and it was difficult, but it was also, coming out on the other side was equally as beautiful and amazing, and like the things that used to catch me don't catch me at all anymore. So
well, there you go.
Yeah.
That's a very cool self-realization moment, I guess.
Yeah.
Hey, when you realize, hey, this doesn't affect me the way that it used to.
Wow, cool.
Huh.
I've moved on from that.
That's cool.
Yeah,
That's really cool.
it's a peaceful feeling. It takes away from anxiety quite a bit too. So yeah.
Very cool. I want to ask you, because you shared this a little bit in your talk, just about general, what you'd recommend for people who want to help someone on the street who they don't necessarily know, or if they just want, like, just passing by. What would you recommend? I know that's a very simple, maybe it seemed like a simple question, but I think there's people who could benefit from hearing your take on that.
Well, for starters, do something.
Right.
Yeah. Don't walk past them no matter what. And obviously, like I said to you, there's times I've come across a homeless person. I can't do anything because I've done something for 5 people before that.
Yeah.
And we don't have unlimited resources.
Right.
But think about it this way. If we all just did a little something, it adds up. For me personally, as I touched on, I prefer to give them food or a gift card or something for whether, whatever coffee shop or place it is, because it also gives them access to the bathroom when you do that. At least the gift card does. But do something, whether it's giving money. There's so many other things you can do too. You can organize a group and put together Ziploc bags or even backpacks, better yet, of basic supplies, things you wouldn't think of because you've never lived on the streets. But when you give a homeless person money, and I know the drug, alcohol, whatever, and you know what, if that's what they need that in that moment, it's just the way it is. It's not your responsibility to determine that. That's not okay. I prefer they eat, obviously, but those are their priorities. So they're not going to get, like, for women, feminine hygiene products. It's a luxury item. Or toothbrush and toothpaste, or underwear or socks, or any number of those little essentials we take for granted. Carrying a little care package, we can all do that. And engaging, even when you don't have something, please engage, smile, say I don't have anything, I'm really sorry, whatever it is. But treat them as they are, which are people that exist, right?
Yeah, human beings for sure.
Yeah.
And what about someone might know, like a child, for example, a student, a niece, a nephew, a friend of a family who you think might be in the steps of becoming a runaway, or after, what would you say for that?
So number one, don't ask questions.
Okay.
Because the answer they give you isn't going to be accurate. You have to remember that when a child is being abused, that is their normal. So you might ask a question, is your mom being mean? Are you being hit? Are you this? Are you that? They're not going to answer you accurately, chances are. Second to that, they feel that they deserve that treatment because it's what they've been conditioned to believe and know. And so the best way to intervene is to become a soft place to fall. If you give a child a soft place to fall, their story is going to naturally unfold. They'll start sharing. They'll start letting you in because you're somebody that they're building trust with, and it's not going to happen overnight. But if I had a place to run to or someone to talk to, I know I wouldn't have ended up on the streets. I had an aunt that intervened to some degree, and I gave her bits of information, and she took it back to my mother, thinking that that would correct the behavior. It made it worse.
Right.
So that's the other part of it. It's a journey that you have to take with the child and determine what's appropriate when, and how to deal with it with them, instead of just adulting, and going, okay, well, I know best, because you don't know how that's going to impact them in the house the next day, for example. So I feel like just giving a soft place to fall. Obviously, if you know a child is in danger physically, you have to report it. I mean, there's no two ways about that. But if you feel like it's something that's tolerable in the meantime, and you can start pulling them towards you, that's a better way to go.
Okay. It's such a valuable thing what you're saying, because I think a lot of people are just in the dark, and they might see a case where it might be that type of situation, and they're not sure. And like you said, if this is normal,
they're afraid to get involved, or
right,
or just when you don't know what to do, a lot of times we do nothing, right? Because it's overwhelming, maybe. So
and fear is such a scary thing if you let it take over,
Yeah.
like you were saying, right? Because it can stop you from helping. But I mean, I think, so many people are worried about being a nuisance rather than a help,
Yeah.
causing an issue rather than not. So
rocking the boat.
right.
Yeah.
But I think also we all have our gut instincts too, right? So if you can see something going on and hear something going on, then okay.
Definitely, if you see a child running, something's happening, and it's not the child.
Mm-hmm.
So be aware of that. I'm not talking about, obviously there's times there's mental health issues, like a child might be, bipolar and not taking meds, or I hear those stories too. But that's like 8 or 10% of the kids that run away.
Wow, 8 to 10%.
Yeah, it's like,
so the other 90%.
Yeah, at least 80% of them are coming from either emotional, physical, and or sexual abuse. They're not running because they fall into drugs. Most of the kids that end up doing drugs, they find them on the streets when they've become runaways. It's not the other way around. So these are all those stigmas that are flying around that are really detrimental to these kids getting the help that they need.
You had also mentioned in your book, and also I haven't read your book yet, but I'm excited to. But also in your talk, you had mentioned of a woman that you referred to as your guardian angel, who was a support system for you in a situation like she clearly saw that you needed help. Would you mind sharing that a little bit?
All. So, and what's so interesting about this is it took place over 2 or 3 days.
Oh, really?
And that was it. It was a really brief period of time. I had been living on a park bench for about a month, and this woman happened by, and she asked me if I was hungry, and I obviously I was. I ended up staying in her house in her very small flat, actually, that was like falling apart. This woman had nothing. I mean, she didn't even have a kitchen. She had a hot plate. She took me in, she fed me, she sheltered me, and then she shared with me that she was a prostitute and that she was on drugs, and that she didn't even remember which situation came first for her. And she made me promise her that I was going to go home, which was not an option for me. So what I did to honor her, not even for my own protection, maybe subconsciously, I promised her myself that I wouldn't do drugs and I wouldn't sell my body. And I ended up still on the streets for 1.5 years until I was 14 and a half years old. And even after that, there were times I had an apartment but no money to eat. You know, like I didn't have an education or sometimes a solid job or whatever. But I never did that. I never did drugs, and I never fell into prostitution. And there is no doubt in my mind that I am as recovered as well as I am, because I know there's people who survive that. But as well as I have because of her. And it's a really good example of how somebody, even just in a short period of time, can make such a tremendous impact on somebody else's life. You know, you just never know. So always get involved. It goes back to that.
Yeah.
Do something. You know, that moment you give food that day to a homeless person and engage might be the day they were thinking about taking their own life and didn't, because somebody took the time for them. Always has a good impact somewhere down the line.
Wow. And I didn't, it's such a, that story is just very heartwarming.
Yeah.
Because I think so many people, as soon as you hear something like that, your heart just comes out. It resonates, because every part of us wants to be able to help people. We like the idea, we like the feeling of helping and being helped. So it's so funny when, not funny, haha, but it's unfortunate when we separate ourselves from each other. It's sad. So when those kind of moments come out, they help you to remember why we're here. You know what I mean? Which is to connect with other people, to be kind to other people.
Absolutely.
You know, and so. Yeah, thank you so much, Marnie.
You're welcome.
Is there anything else that you would like to share with listeners before we wind up our interview?
Not really anything that I can think of. I think we covered everything so well.
Yeah.
You know, just, I mean, the thought that I would leave is just remember to do something. We have a choice every day to do something or to do nothing. It's our great equalizer, or at least one of them. And choose to do something kind every single day. And if everybody did that, just imagine what the world, you know, how much a better place it would be. It's pretty great, but it could be that much greater. So.
Very nice. Thank you. You can definitely have Marnie come and speak at one of your events. She is, well, her book you can definitely purchase as well. Can they have access to your book on your website?
Yes, absolutely.
And would you mind mentioning your website?
It is www.marnie, MARNIE, Grundman, GRUNDMAN.com. And you can also find the different topics that I speak on, because while I weave my experience into what I talk about, some of the things are geared towards mindset. Some of them are for destigmatizing runaways specifically, or healing. So I have an array of topics.
Okay, wonderful. Marnie, thank you so much for being a guest today, and thank you to everyone for listening.